If you couldn't tell, we're pretty big fans of FromSoft over here at Tarnished Archaeology. Do we sleep with a poster of Miyazaki-san above our heads? Possibly. But by the looks of things, we are not alone. Not only have Miyazaki and Company's games become increasingly popular just by pure sales numbers, but there is an astonishing abundance of material on YouTube dissecting every component of these games. The boss fights, the level design, the PvP, and, most impressively, the world building and lore. It starts harmlessly enough with a couple of Vaati prepare to cry videos, and before you know it, you're down the rabbit hole of how Velka is actually the Witch of Izalith, and how the pendant is secretly the most important lore item in the game. This dedication, possibly obsession, is a clear testament to their enduring narrative power. But why? I mean, sure, they're great games, but why are so many people so uniquely obsessed with the worlds that FromSoft creates? Of course, there's no single reason why. These games are extremely well crafted at almost every level, and plenty of people play them just for the bosses or just for the PvP. But we have a suggestion as to an underappreciated reason why these games resonate with so many people. The worlds of FromSoft games are shockingly indifferent to your presence. It is precisely the opposite of most fictional worlds, which, often quite literally, only exist from the perspective of the main character. The treasures of FromSoft's fictional worlds are there if you seek them, but no one is telling you that you have to go find them, no compass directing you to the next objective, no text that will explain the curious ruins laying in front of you. If you would like, you can play the game going from boss to boss and bopping them on their heads, or more likely, their butts. But in a moment of peace between the boss fights, if you do look at the world around you, you may discover hidden depth that is uniquely unintrusive. And in that way, though of course they are full of fantastical and frankly quite absurd creations, they often come closer to the experience of exploring the real world than most fictional worlds could ever dream of. Let's not forget, this is a company that hired the world's most famous fantasy author to write a highly detailed setting and backstory to their world, knowing full well that they would eventually remove or conceal 90% of what he wrote. This is depth that is not just hidden, but it is indifferent towards whether or not it is discovered. So, why are FromSoft games special? Well, to start with, it's because they just don't really care about you, and whether or not you discover all of their secrets. And you know what? We love it. It sets the tone for a world that does not merely exist just to facilitate your experience. Instead, it exists entirely independently of you. Now, let us show you why that is a key part of Miyazaki's creative genius. Hidden deep within the Mistwood Forest lies an unassuming structure that conceals one of Elden Ring's most stunning revelations. At the bottom of the magical elevator ride, the player is transported, not just deep underground, but almost literally back in time, as they pass through the various layers of history hidden within the world. The ruins of the ancient dynasty, with their classical and Hellenistic style, and the more recent city of Nokron nestled within them, are truly impressive to behold, and they convey the deep history of this world. The relationship between these two civilizations, the ancient dynasty and the eternal cities, is never explicitly explained. There is no item description that tells us how the ancient dynasty fell, or how they were conquered by the Nox, or even where the eternal cities came from. But the careful observer will see the story there all the same. Their relationship mirrors that of the real-world Hellenistic world, and their successors, the Romans, something we have detailed in other videos. But regardless of whether or not you know that specific context, even on your first playthrough you can tell there are some layers here, and you get the sense that it is not just all for you. Later on, the player will come across ruined ancient dynasty columns and great monumental statues of an unknown figure, a man so distant to the current time that there is literally nothing in the entire game that even references him. We've dubbed him the Dynast, but someone cleverer than we are called him Elden John. But no matter what you call him, it's probably not his name because, well, we don't know what his name is. And closer inspection of his statues reveals that he contains a near-identical replica of the Imago Mundi, aka the Babylonian world map, at his feet, while he clutches a separate tablet containing a depiction of a sacred tree. So putting this together, we know why he's so important. He's a critical character in the origin story of tree worship in the lands between. But just think about that for a second. The developers created the idea of this character, his critical role thousands of years prior to the events of the game, and then decided to remove all textual evidence of him and leave only the tiniest little morsels of evidence of his story. And listen, of course, nobody understands the full scope of this story as they ride through Liurnia for the first time, or even the fifth time. But it conveys to the player that this world has history, whether you choose to uncover it or not. In an interview about Elden Ring, Miyazaki said this regarding the Round Table Hold, another one of Elden Ring's deeply mysterious locations. Quote, "As for the reason behind the Round Table Hold's existence, while there is lore answering that question, it's something we decided not to touch upon in-game, so I won't be revealing it here." End quote. And there you have it. Confirmation from the man himself that there is so much more to the story than just what is contained in-game. But it is largely unknowable. And again, this is so much more true to the real world than most fiction, as opposed to the tedious compendia of the Silmarillion and its ilk, containing thousands and thousands of years of unimpeachable historical fact. Most of real human history is completely unknowable. We simply do not know and will never know the stories of the vast majority of people who have ever lived. Even time periods of relatively abundant evidence, periods we think we know a lot about, like the late Roman Republic, for example, from Romans who left letters and monuments and buildings all over the place, we still know only a minuscule fraction of what we'd like to. Sure, we know how Cicero felt about, well, pretty much everything, because the guy basically never shut up, and we have a great abundance of his letters. But for your average Roman, much less your average human being anywhere else in the world at that time, all is silence. And the further back in time we go, the less we can say for sure. As we've touched upon before in this series, some of the most famous sites in history are still the most mysterious. We don't know why Stonehenge was built, and we may never know for sure. But it is here, in the deep mists of time where history and legend meet, that the brilliance of these worlds shines brightest. Because Miyazaki and his team understand, better than one could ever hope for, how history and myth often go hand in hand, and how, even if the facts of the world thousands of years ago become increasingly obscure, a good story can penetrate that fog. In the world of Dark Souls, perhaps no figure is more legendary than Knight Artorias. And when we say legendary, we mean that quite literally, because we are told of his accomplishments. The only knight brave enough to battle Manus in the Abyss, his unbendable will so legendary that his armor and rings still attest to it. The cult of Artorias' legend is still practiced, so to speak, at his monumental grave in the Darkroot Garden, a grave, by the way, still guarded by his loyal wolf Sif. Of course, if you've played the DLC, you know that his legend is, in many ways, a lie. Artorias may have been brave, but we'll never know the full extent of it. He was definitely strong, as we see when we confront him, but his will, however rigid, was not, in the end, unbreakable. The Artorias we meet is far from the man of the legends. Instead, he is broken, both physically and psychologically, consumed by the abyss, the very thing he swore to defeat. And once we defeat him, we see that his true grave isn't even the monumental one, but one hurriedly made, ad hoc, by an old friend, out of the ruins of the Colosseum where he was slain. This is a more honest warrior's grave than the one we find many centuries later in the Darkroot Basin, so core to his legend that the legend appears to be literally written on it. But the story doesn't end there, of course. Once we defeat the husk of Artorias, we end up creating his legend by traveling to the chasm of the abyss and defeating its father, Manus.
The legend of Artorias art none but a fabrication. Traversing the dark. 'Tis but a fairy tale.
Miyazaki and his surrogate Elizabeth know the power of a story, and so once you've completed your task and slain Manus, Elizabeth will propagate the story of Artorias' bravery, not yours.
I will remember thee, but I will keep thy story to myself. This is the best way, for thou art come from a time far ahead. No one will sing thy praises, but yet thy greatness shall live on, for it shall be my purpose to remember all thou hast done for us.
Artorias' story, not ours, is so powerful that it reverberates even thousands of years later to the events of the third game, when a group of warrior zealots, known as the Abyss Watchers, consciously and deliberately lay claim to the legendary heritage of Artorias, when they make a pact of wolf blood, at once honoring their patron saint and sealing their tragic fate. So much time has passed between then and now that the Abyss Watchers replicate one of the symbols of Artorias' grave. The gauntlet of swords laid blade first into the ground, without knowing that the true origin of this symbol was something much less spectacular, that they were the swords of dead bandits coming to rob Artorias' grave. In that way, it's a bit like the crucifix, which to the Romans of the 1st century AD was a horrifying symbol, as it would have meant death by the most humiliating and excruciating means possible. This was a fate reserved for enemies of the state. For example, how thousands of slaves met their end crucified after the Spartacus rebellion. But in time, this symbol would come to mean something very different to the over 1 billion Christians of the world. Symbols change over time, especially when they are so far removed from their original context. And this is where Miyazaki's understanding of history and myth helps to create a world that, while fantastical, feels so much like our own. In the end, it doesn't really matter what the facts of Jesus of Nazareth's or Siddhartha Gautama's life actually were. What matters now is that the stories told about them continue to inspire and motivate billions of people to this very day. And does it really matter that the Abyss Watchers don't know the full context of Artorias' legend? Maybe, but it matters even more that they believe the myth. Back in our Eternal Cities episode, when we told the story of Xenophon unknowingly camping outside the ruins of ancient Nineveh, we emphasized the fact that, though they are both ancient to us, Nineveh was already forgotten by Xenophon's time, only a few hundred years after its glorious peak. But what we didn't tell you is that, millennia later, in the 19th century, archaeologists would discover the ruined library of Nineveh, built by the great king Ashurbanipal. Among the treasures of this library was found, and eventually decoded, the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest written story. Nineveh itself may have vanished, but Gilgamesh's story lives on. If you go far enough back into human existence, there is little left but dust. Buildings, statues, codices, even the lands itself degrade over time. But the stories that originate from these times can, every so often, pierce the fog, and be told and retold even today. That a video game, of all things, would have this level of historical and mythological sophistication, that it would choose to show you how history and myth diverge, intersect and evolve is quite a remarkable thing indeed. Okay. We don't want to get too artsy here. After all, we are fake video game archaeologists, not fake video game philosophers. But there is something quite beautiful about this style of world building, because it allows the player to construct their own meaning as they play, rather than have it simply told to them. The full scope of the narrative can only be actively generated. Again, so much is unknowable or deliberately concealed from the player, so the process of playing the game is a process of narrative creation. And narrative creation, not just being told the story through cutscenes, is central to the experience of playing these games, as it often is in the real world too. We don't want to burst anyone's bubble here, but as it turns out, much of archaeology involves narrative creation as well. It is one thing to find a bunch of artifacts amidst a specific burn layer and dutifully catalog them, but it is quite another to tell the story of the collapse of an ancient civilization and the burning of its palace. Which one do you think is more compelling? So it has always been. When Leonard Woolley found the Royal Cemetery of Ur, one of the most spectacular finds in the history of archaeology, he did not merely catalog the positions of the bodies laid to rest some 4,000 years ago, the fine jewelry some of them wore indicating social hierarchy, the instruments and weapons surrounding them in the grave pit. No, instead he couldn't help himself but to tell the story of these people. In his own words, quote, "Each man and woman brought a little cup of clay or stone or metal, the only equipment required for the rite that was to follow." Some kind of service there must have been at the bottom of the shaft. At least it is evident that the musicians played up to the last, and that each drank from the cup. Either they brought the potion with them, or they found it prepared for them on the spot, and they composed themselves for death. Then someone came down and killed the animals and arranged the drugged bodies, and when that was done, earth was flung from above them, and the filling in of the grave shaft was begun. End quote. You'd be forgiven for thinking, after reading all that Woolley watched some kind of ancient VHS tape displaying the funeral procession. But no, that was pretty much straight from his imagination, and we may never know how close to the truth it was. The point is, narrative creation is an inescapable human tendency. We are storytellers, and we create stories even from stone tools and bones that have laid still and silent for thousands of years. Speaking of stories being told about old bones, Demon Souls. Having established how history and myth intertwine and how narrative creation is an active process, the developers take this one step further and show us how the stories we tell, can actually become reality. Nowhere better exemplified than in Demon Souls' Shrine of Storms. In that game, myth literally makes reality, because the power of the Demon Souls are used to reify the legends of old. The Tower Knight is the legendary gigantic version of an actual warrior. The cowardly phalanx, hiding behind a wall of shields, reflects the myth around the archer longbow Ulan. Even in Stonefang, the ancient burrowers uncovered what were basically dinosaur fossils, and, not knowing any better, considered them to be the remains of an old dragon god, even going so far as to build that god a temple, in the hopes of appeasing and constraining it. This is not so dissimilar from Leonard Woolley at Ur, the uncovering of ancient bones and the weaving of a narrative to explain them. And lo and behold, when the power of the Demon Souls arose once more, the dragon god of myth became reality. Each of these are quite beautiful stories that we hope to have more time to talk about in future episodes, but here we want to focus on the Shrine of Storms, because the myth is, well, quite odd. In this storm-swept isle, the archdemon boss is a giant flying manta ray, so I guess the implication would be that the locals worshipped manta rays, and those manta rays are somehow associated with the coming of a storm? What's the story here? Well, as is Miyazaki's custom, nobody ever explicitly tells us, but the clues start to add up, and one tiny visual detail caught our eye: a pile of dead rays lying atop a rocky outcrop. just after the Adjudicator Arena. How did these get up here, and what's it got to do with the Storm King boss? Well, imagine you are living in a Stone Age society in a storm-swept island like this, and one day, after a particularly heavy storm, you come across a creature, known to us as a Manta Ray, that you've never seen before. And not only that, but it's lying atop a cliff, hundreds of feet in the air. What would you conclude? Well, you'd probably conclude that this magical creature could fly. After all, it does appear to have some sort of wings. And because you found it here after a storm, you might reasonably conclude that this creature somehow brought the storm. This, by the way, is an actual phenomenon. You can find historical descriptions and even some photos of fish and other sea creatures raining down on land during a storm.
This happens. This is something that happens. This is something that happens.
The actual mechanism of this is debated, but among the common folk, it is believed that sea creatures are sucked up from the sea and dropped onto land by the storm. So is it really a stretch to think, if you were living in a Stone Age island and came across this astonishing find, and you didn't have the benefit of Wikipedia, that you might conclude that this is some kind of magical flying creature that harnesses the storm? You and your buddies might even start telling stories about these creatures and start worshipping them, since the storms that batter your island also bring shipwrecks, a precious source of trinkets from the outside world. You might even start making sacrifices to these unseen gods. By appeasing the storm gods, you believe you are ensuring your people's continued survival. And voila, a religion is born. And thousands of years later, when the power of the demon souls is resurrected, this is precisely the form that the archdemon takes, the Storm King. Of course, we'll never know for sure, like Wooly at Ur, if this is exactly why the developers decided to put a couple of dead rays atop the cliff, but the story helps to explain much of what we see. This is how legends are born and how they become reality. Just think of the beautiful, tragic, complex stories in these games. Solaire's false son, Lady Maria, The Painted Worlds, Henri and Horace, and 100 others. We don't talk much about these stories because everybody pretty much already knows them. What distinguishes FromSoft games is that somehow, in defiance of all conventional wisdom, the developers put no less effort into the untold stories as the told ones. This unusual creative process, by which the boss fight isn't just created to look cool or play well, which of course it also does, but is instead created with a full history and the backstory of the area in mind, is precisely what creates these games' distinctive feel. Then, because we are shown but not told, the player understands implicitly the depth of this world. Miyazaki and his team have created a world so rich in detail but yet so often missing explicit story links that we, the players, after noticing a curiously out-of-place ray or a broken statue grasping an ancient tablet, can't help but to fill in the gaps ourselves. So in the end, why are these worlds so captivating? Well, because they are full to the brim of history that, just like in our own world, is often just out of reach, is distorted and fragmented by time, and that, in the end, doesn't really care whether you notice it or not. But if you do choose to dig a little deeper, you will find a world where history and myth intertwine. A world that mirrors our own in a way no other fantasy world ever could.